So how does someone become an extremist? Is it just a switch that flips? Or is it more of a slow burn? Today, we're going to dig into some really powerful personal stories and analyses to try and understand that path, the one that leads people in, and, just as importantly, what it takes to find a way back out.
Wow. Just let that sink in for a second. That's a quote from a man named Mubin Sheikh, and his story is, well, it's a wild ride. He went from literally celebrating terrorism to becoming an undercover counterterrorism agent for the Canadian government. It's an unbelievable transformation. And that right there, that's the big question we're tackling. How does a middle-class kid from a country like Canada end up there? It's not a simple answer, for sure. But it's a journey that tells us a ton about identity, ideology, and, all the different forces pulling on us. So let's start at the beginning.
Okay, first things first. This isn't about some bad seed theory. People aren't born extremists. It's a process. In Mubin Sheikh's story, it really shows us exactly how that process works.
Right? Extremists are made, not born. This is the core idea we really have to get our heads around. There's no extremist switch that suddenly flips on. It's more like a series of steps, a chain of events and psychological changes that slowly push someone down a very specific road. And that road starts way, way before anyone even thinks about violence.
So look at this. This is where it gets really interesting for Shaikh. His childhood was basically split in two. During the day, he's in a totally normal, supportive Canadian public school. Boys and girls together, a caring environment. But then, evenings and weekends, a completely different story. A Quran school where it's all about rote memorization, segregation, and even physical punishment for getting things wrong. Can you imagine the whiplash? This created a massive identity crisis for him. He was literally living in two different worlds.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of an identity crisis. The ground is fertile, so to speak. So what happens next? Let's break down how that vulnerability turns into actual radicalization, looking at both the personal triggers and some of the bigger picture factors.
For Sheikh, it all came to a head with what's called a shame event. He threw a house party, and his uncles just laid into him, telling him he dishonored the entire family. He was crushed by guilt, and his solution? He decided he had to get religious to make things right. That quest for redemption took him to Pakistan, and there, he met some guys who didn't just talk. They handed him an AK-47 and said, this is how you make a real change. And just like that, he was hooked.
But Sheikh's story is just one example. There are a lot of different roads that lead to the same place. For some people, it's indoctrination right from childhood, being taught to hate. For others, it's geopolitics. They see videos online of Muslims being persecuted around the world, and it sparks this outrage. Then you've got things like poverty or coming from a rough background. When you feel like you have nothing, and a group comes along and offers you a purpose, a family, that's a really powerful and really dangerous pull.
All right, so we've talked about the why, the psychological and social stuff. Now let's talk about the what. What's the actual ideology? Because this is where the interpretation of religious texts becomes everything.
Okay, this is super important to understand. You have Sharia, which is seen as the divine, perfect, unchangeable will of God. But then you have fiqh. Fiqh is the human understanding of Sharia. It's the laws and rules that scholars have debated and written down over centuries. Here's the trick extremists play. They take their own very specific, very human interpretation, their fiqh, and they present it as if it's the divine, infallible Sharia. They're basically saying, our opinion is God's law. It's a huge bait and switch. And this just drives that point home. Look at all these different schools of thought. You've got 5 major ones spread all over the world. There isn't one single way to interpret Islamic law. There's a ton of diversity and debate. And that's the complete opposite of what extremists want you to believe. They want one rigid, narrow, my way or the highway version.
So how do they build that narrow version? Well, Mubin Sheikh puts it perfectly. He says they cherry-pick and mutilate the understanding of Islam. Think about it. They'll grab a verse from here, ignore the 5 verses around it that give it context, and just run with it because it fits their violent narrative. The sources tell us that chapter 9 of the Quran is often their go-to. They treat it like their ultimate marching orders, ignoring a whole lot of other stuff in the process.
And this isn't just some academic debate about theology, right? This ideology has very real, very serious consequences. Let's look at 2 big ones: how it treats women and how it views the Western world.
This is a really tough quote. According to ex-Muslim activist Nuria Khan, this line, attributed to the Prophet's wife Aisha, is used to justify the harsh treatment of women.
The idea being that even believing women within the faith, can be disciplined in this way. It's a really stark look at the internal logic of this worldview.
And here's a number that just says it all: 1/2. According to some of the interpretations we're looking at, in a court of law, a woman's testimony is literally considered worth half that of a man's, just half.
So that's the internal view. But what about the rest of the world? Well, the ideology has some pretty big external goals too. The sources describe the ultimate endgame for some fundamentalists as nothing less than establishing global Sharia law. As one person put it, very bluntly, the future of America has to be Muslim.
So, how do they think they're going to achieve that? Well, according to the sources, they see the West very strategically. Things we consider strengths, like freedom and openness, they see those as weaknesses, as loopholes to be exploited. Open immigration is seen as a way to infiltrate. And get this, one former extremist said they actually saw left-leaning political movements as stupid but useful allies. Why? Because while they were focused on their own political battles, it created a perfect distraction from the fundamentalists' core agenda.
Okay, so if there's a path in, there has to be a path out, right? Let's go back to Mubin Sheikh's story, because getting out of this mindset is just as much of a journey as getting it.
For Sheikh, the wake-up call came in Syria. He'd moved his whole family there, chasing this ideal of living in a pure Islamic society. But the reality was nothing like the brochure. He didn't find a spiritual utopia. He found a brutal, oppressive police state, and in that moment it hit him just how much freedom he'd taken for granted back in Canada. The dream just completely fell apart.
But just feeling let down wasn't enough to get him out. The real change was intellectual. He met a young Islamic scholar who basically sat down with him for a year and a half and dismantled his entire belief system, piece by piece. They went through the exact same texts the extremists used, chapter and verse, and the scholar showed him, look, here's where your understanding went wrong. Here's the context you're missing. He was basically de-radicalized with knowledge. He was argued out of it.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's an absolutely incredible journey. You go from a kid struggling with his identity in Canada, to a radicalized extremist celebrating 9/11, to being totally disillusioned in Syria, and then full circle. He comes back and becomes a counterterrorism operative. He literally ends up fighting the same fire he used to spread.
So, all of this leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? If extremism is a path people are led down, what does it take to build more exits off that highway? Mubin Sheikh's story proves it's possible. You need that initial crack in the belief system for sure, but more than that, you need to offer a better, more compelling story. Understanding how these paths are built isn't just an interesting thought experiment, it's the only way we can figure out how to build more ways out.